Hello and welcome to session 156 in the AI Safety Reading Group. Tonight, Stuart Armstrong will present his research agenda. Please take it away, Stuart.
Hello there, and thanks for inviting me to talk here. I'm actually going to get to the research agenda in a very roundabout way, presenting a few related intuitions which basically explain why I think that there's a chance of the research agenda succeeding. But to start off with, one question is to ask in reverse. What would a solution look like? Suppose we said we had all of human preferences in some compact form or some utility function form. How would we have got it? There's a few ways we could have got it. Effective proxy methods, which are most of the methods that people suggest, like putting Nick Bostrom in a room for 10,000 subjective years to think of things, or having people write what they want and somehow synthesizing from that. These don't measure preferences directly, but they are proxy measures, and we're hoping that we can get them to work out. Another approach which might work is corrigibility. We start with one goal structure and we modify it successfully and repeatedly until it aligns more with what we want. There's the catch-all of some brilliant new idea. And finally, some grounded definition of human preferences. So something that actually captures our preferences. And I argue, in fact, that anything of this type is going to look somewhat similar to my research agenda. It needs to have some fundamental definition of the pieces, some way of putting them all together, and some way of respecting meta preferences and other things of that nature. Now, one key insight where I tend to differ from Miri is on the issue of patching or nearest unblock strategy arguments. The basic idea is, suppose we have an AI that for some reason goes straight to doom. We say, no, don't go there. So the AI just roots around whatever our no is. We can add quite a lot of patches blocking different ways, and then it just roots around those patches. This is the idea of the nearest unblock strategy. Like, for example, you say increase human hedonism or increase human pleasure, and then when that ends up disastrously, you say, but okay, respect human autonomy, don't force humans into bunkers, and we keep on patching, and in each case it finds the closest cheating thing that technically satisfies our preferences. But compare this with sort of drawing boundaries in as high depth neural nets tend to, drawing boundaries in concept spaces. If we have a bunch of blue counterexamples and a bunch of red good examples, then the AIs can naturally draw a boundary around this. And at this point, even though that arrow I've just drawn doesn't go through or close to any of the blue points, because it's learned to generalize the concept, it doesn't go to that disaster area. So what this shows is that the error modes of machine learning and neural nets with positive and negative examples are different from the error modes of the nearest unblock strategy problem. So this is why I hold out some hope for more fuzzy methods. Now, of course, generally what happens if you have a lot of examples close by and not far off, you constrain it in one area and then it goes wild elsewhere. So we sort of have to be able to give counterexamples very far away, which in some cases we can, like human preference for, say, no human suffering. If we can define that approximately, this extends across really alien universes, really strange and different worlds from our own. So this is a sort of global constraint. Similarly, if we find the repugnant conclusion repugnant, that's a sort of global constraint. Anyway, this was just one intuition, and I also feel that things like symbol grounding, off-distribution behavior, and a few other things can be potentially solved in this kind of way. This is one of the fundamental intuitions. Now, to get to the no free lunch theorem, famous throughout the world by everyone who happens to know it, this was my result that if you have a behavior, you cannot go straight to preferences. The behavior of a potentially irrational agent, you cannot go straight to preferences. We can't get the preferences without making assumptions about the rationality. You can't get the rationality without making assumptions about the preferences. This is not a not very exciting no free lunch theorem, because normally no free lunch theorems, you just use a simplicity prior and they go away. Unfortunately, here simplicity priors don't help. And as I've mentioned, I think before, humans are fully rational, humans are fully anti-rationals, and humans have flat preferences are the simplest interpretation of human behavior. But notice I said you needed to make assumptions. What would be great, needed to not make assumptions. So if you can make just very simple assumptions and get around the whole problem, that would be great. So the whole infrastructure of the research agenda is to try and make some minimal assumptions and a lot of construction, and this leads us to a way of going and finding the preferences of the human. Right. And another important point is that interpreting a human as having preferences or rationality is a stance. It's very similar to Dennett's intentional stance. We're not treating a human as a collection of neurons or collection of atoms. We are treating them as an agent with preferences. This is not something that naturally exists in the world. So, as I said, a super-intelligent AI could have all the world's video feeds, all of Wikipedia, all social science research, give perfect predictions of human behavior, be able to manipulate us incredibly well, and still conclude that humans are fully rational. And it would not be wrong. It wouldn't be right, but it wouldn't be wrong. Because rationality and preferences are an interpretation we put upon other agents. In fact, even calling something an agent is a preference, is an interpretation. And here, some people feel a natural objection. They say that they know what humans want from observing them. And we do. And even more damning, in a sense, is our observation of human preferences allows us to predict their behavior. So this approach is vindicated by the outcomes. So what is going on? I've just said that this cannot be done. Well, this is a sort of simple model of what's happening. I see a human H as having an empathy machine and a human predictor. They've co-evolved. The empathy machine is what tells us what people want and how they think. And the predictor tells us what they act. So if we have a typical history of a human H, then two different humans looking at it will find roughly the same thing. We tend to agree very strongly on what people want and how rational they are. Not perfectly, but far, far better than chance. Also, the human themselves tends to agree with our assessment. When we're drunk, we're less rational, and we tend to agree that we're less rational when we're drunk, for example. So these empathy modules all give pretty much the same thing on typical histories. And then if you feed these things to the predictor, then in typical circumstances, this is a pretty good predictor of the human action. So given the empathy module and the preference model, the reward is simple to deduce, and typically it is predictive. So this is my sort of response to the objection. Yes, for humans, with our specific evolved ability, we can do this task, but it's not a general task that is easy to do. It's because of our particular cognitive machinery and our own assumptions. Now, this EH, this empathy module, is strongly related to the partial preferences that I'm about to get into. This brings us finally to the actual research agenda. The idea is to start with code, or the human brain, and from this get the mental models that the human preferences are using. So when we think, oh, that's a bad outcome, or I wouldn't want that, or I really want that, or if I do this, I might get something good. These are all mental models, and within these mental models, we tend to express desirable or undesirable outcomes. So from these mental models, we can have orderings over different circumstances. Notice, and some of them are meta preferences, which can tell us about our lower level preferences. In order to do this, we need to do some sort of human symbol grounding, which is why I addressed it in the research agenda. And this is where I bring in the assumption. The assumption is that these partial preferences, as I'm calling them, that they're normative, that this is what preferences are built out of. So I've gone from the observation that human mental models order things in a particular way to the assumption, the requirement, that this ordering tells us something about what the genuine preferences are. This is sort of my stance. Then, given that and some alchemical complicated process, we can get the human preferences. Now, a lot of the research agenda and a lot of the research on it is going to be about this step. But it's in essence not that important a step. What it has to do two things, well, three things. It has to reach a conclusion of what the preferences are, and it has to sort out all our contradictions and underdefined things, and it has to do this while respecting our meta preferences. So all the machinery of the section 2, I believe, is basically a way of doing this. And hopefully the particular way of doing it will not be that important in terms of reaching an acceptable or a good outcome. Then, once we have those preferences, we put them into the AI, and then we're almost done. To do that, we need to do some sort of AI symbol grounding, which I wasn't working on too much, but I've now realized is actually quite an important bit. So I will be working on that in the future. Of course, you don't know the human source code perfectly, but some uncertainty about that source code will just result in some uncertainty on the ideal world. And this actually should end up okay for arguments that I've sketched in the anti-Goodhart posts, or how to break Goodhart. In this setting, human behavior is an observation that gives evidence about our internal makeup and about the symbol grounding. Now, because it's good to bring in a little bit of formality, I have put various ones of these things in symbols, more or less justified. So the human code leads to pre-orders, which is how we order our partial preferences. And so this is basically, we order things in our models, without having full models of the world or comparing everything. We just compare on one feature. Then the symbol grounding, for which I have stolen concepts from semantics, formal semantics, to go from human models to worlds. The pre-orders are now on worlds. The assumption is that these pre-orders are preferences relevant. The pre-orders are synthesized into utility function using some process sigma. The meta preferences are taken to mean be preferences over the sigma. Then another round of symbol grounding, and we get the utility function in the AI. Now, and the empathy modules that I talked about are very closely connected with our pre-orders. So how we model other people is very similar to their internal models. So these internal models are very closely related to how we model other people. And there are too many uses of the word model in that sentence, I know. So finally, this is just a small section of some of the preliminary work I've done. The process is constructive, and the main point of all this work is to check that there were no huge conceptual holes, rather than solving every problem, or indeed any problem, to extreme detail, just to check that there were no large holes that I was missing. And that is it. Thank you. Should I stop?
Thank you very much.
Now?
Thank you very much, Stuart. Yeah, if you could stop sharing, and then I will share my screen, and then we will take some questions. And the way we always do this is that we, we take, I keep a list with where people who have said they would like to pose questions. So we are in the order where people raise their hand either through the chat or if they say something. I will take the very first question. You should be able to see my screen. Is that correct? Can everybody see my screen?
Yes, I do.
Okay, so please, if you have a question, write in the chat or raise your hand. I think it's possible to raise your hand through this. Matthias has a question, so he will be second, because I always take the first question. And so my first question is about instrumental goals, because Nick Bostrom divides goals into instrumental goals and final goals. And a lot of the questions, the examples that are given in the research agenda, have to do with instrumental goals. Things that, like, I wish I was rich rather than poor, or I don't want to get mugged, or things like that. And these kind of things are not in the research agenda really specified. This kind of division is left to the process mostly. But there's in the reading group we've discussed this, and it seems to be in some way instrumental goals are quite a lot easier to work with than final goals. In that you could imagine normalizing all kinds of instrumental goals into some kind of general goal-reaching ability, and just say, I want to be as instrumentally powerful as possible, and then only focus on final goals. Do you think this kind of distinction makes sense?
In humans, a lot of things that should be instrumental goals are pretty much terminal goals, or very close to terminal goals. You could say, well, I want to be rich because I want to do stuff and I want to have high status. Those are two terminal goals. I don't want to get mugged because mugging can get hurt or embarrassing. Those are two terminal goals. So though these are technically instrumental goals, they are very close to terminal goals. In a sense, the Eliezer Yudkowsky "Thou Art God Shatter" article, that evolution's terminal goals of having lots and lots of grandchildren and great-grandchildren have shattered into lots of pieces, and it seems that for humans, we have a lot more terminal goals than we should. Yeah, and the sort of terminal goals that philosophers like to talk about are things we have constructed using our meta preferences. So I want everyone to be happy and to be able to eat as much as they need every day, for example, is a goal that's constructed by my meta preferences and sort of extended out from certain basic empathy goals. So I wouldn't say it's instrumental versus terminal, but sort of short-term, clear-cut goals versus synthesized meta-preference-based goals. Does that make sense?
I think it did, yes. Okay, we have a question from Matthias, and then one from Robert and Ashes.
So as a follow-up question to Soren's, so if human goals are generally terminal rather than instrumental, doesn't it follow from that human goals then often will be in direct conflict with each other? And wouldn't you have to work out how to value one human's preferences against another's?
Yes. Human goals are generally going to contradict the goals of other humans. More importantly, human goals are going to contradict other human goals within the same human. So there are huge masses of contradictions out there. But contradictions are not that hard to solve. You need a way of normalizing the utility function, which is why that pops up in the research agenda, and then add them together. Because goals are virtually never completely opposed. They're almost always positive sum in some ways. There's always some outcome that is where you can increase one without decreasing the other, or increase them both to some extent. So actually contradictions are relatively solvable in theory. What I say about human goals is that they are contradictory, manipulable, and underdefined. You need other tools to deal with the manipulable aspect, but you need a lot. It's the underdefined which is the really big problem. Extending them to new situations, especially situations very alien from the ones we have. I mentioned that the empathy modules serve in typical situations. They don't in untypical situations where things start getting very odd, where the world and the people in it become very different from what we're used to. Those are the things where you have the problem of extending the goals.
Yeah, that answers the question pretty well. And actually also answered the other question I had, so let's jump to the next person.
Okay.
Great. That would be Robert.
Hi. So this is something that wasn't talked about very much in the presentation, or possibly at all, but it was a question that came up while I was reading the post. And we might have a slide for it. I don't know, because I think we talked about it before. But I was a little confused about the identity-related preferences, about why they are singled out, or not singled out, but like picked out as a specific subcategory that is sort of treated differently. I was thinking about one of the examples that's used in the post is, if I hear a good argument for X, I want to believe X. And I was wondering how that is, like, is that an identity preference? And if not, how is it different from something like, I want to be the kind of person who is moved by good arguments?
I see them both as identity preferences.
Okay.
The non-identity version of that would be, I want the AI to be moved by good arguments and optimize the world according to that. It's because of the I specific. It's not just that I want the world to be the best, it's that I want to be convincible about what's best as well. The reason I separated out the identity preferences is because they seem to be very important in humans and very, very likely to get lost in the sort of stereotypical idea of building an expected utility maximizer. Nick Bostrom had a mindless outsourcers example where you basically outsource everything in the name of efficiency, and even in this case, we outsource everything in the name of our goals, and our goals are accomplished, but there's no us left to appreciate it or to care. And since now, why did I bother to separate out identity preferences? Well, it's because I was building a default framework for people who didn't have heavily developed meta preferences. And it seemed to me that identity preferences work more as a smooth min than as an additive. As in, if you lose one completely, it's a disaster, even if you max out on the other. It's because you are, in a sense, not the same person. So it's much better to not lose on any of them and maybe push them all up a little bit than it is to push some of them up massively and drop the other ones quite a bit. So it might not be necessary, but it just felt like a good default to separate them out.
Like a design decision.
Yes.
Necessity. That makes sense. Thanks.
Okay. Ashes?
I have I have a post coming up soon, which I'm going to call, let me just find the name that I found, on gratification, which may address some of these issues in part in a way that doesn't, that's maybe a bit less identity. Anyway, it might make it clearer, some of these aspects. I'm working on that post, and I will post it hopefully within a few days. It is relevant. I sort of see it as a third piece between hedonism and preferences.
Thanks, I'll look out for that.
Yeah. So Ashes is putting his typing up his question right now. Would it be fair to say that there are like two kinds of preferences? Those that should be dealt with as soft min, and those that should just be maximized. And it's somewhat of a coincidence that a lot of the soft min have to do with identity preferences, and the ones that could just be added have to do with preferences over the state of the world.
Well, a lot of them, in a sense, if the sort of hypotheticals, I call them the one-step hypotheticals, brief description of the world, of a hypothetical world, what do you prefer there? If those work well and can be done well, then in a sense we sort of get the trade-off between all the preferences in all the different contexts. So that would tend to basically override, show whether things are adding linearly or in other ways, and that would tend to override. The separate out the identity is for the situation where it's a default. So it's basically if we can't do the hypotheticals well, or we don't have much information to go on, we'll do this as this is what seems to me the most prudent initial way, that can be modified by meta preferences, that can be modified by one-step hypotheticals in various situations, but that is sort of the best default in my view. It's also, another reason is that this is sort of a reminder there are identity preferences. Anything of preference synthesis needs to remember them, and so just labeling them is good for that.
Okay.
Okay. Here. It is, I'll read out the question.
Thank you.
Oh, well, people can see it anyway, but I'll read it out anyway. It was in relation to the Heisenbergian nature of preferences. Given that human preferences are relatively volatile to human knowledge of those preferences, calling me out as a racist may change my mental state quite a bit, to give a crude example. how do we make an AI collect preferences without manipulating a human more than necessary? Okay, well, we can define the problem. Okay, there's a paper which I've written on how to learn when your learning is also a manipulation. It has been refined by various co-authors for 2 years, and so is not out yet. So I have actually worked quite a bit on how you learn without manipulating, or learn when your actions are manipulative. But since that's not out, the one way you could deal with this is by saying what would the human preferences have been in a given week that is in the past. Now, the AI cannot manipulate those past preferences through its current actions. It can just find out about what they were or what they would have been. We can add these sort of hypotheticals. If at any point during the past week we had asked the human a one-step hypothetical, what would they have answered? That is the definition of the human preferences. And this avoids the manipulation issue. They also become irrelevant since they're adapted. Now, this is an issue which I don't really know how to solve. I alluded to it in section 4, things I don't know how to do now. Now, some of those things were actually things I have a pretty clear idea of how to do it, but I don't want to talk about it in this research agenda. But things like this are the real things I don't know how to do. There's kind of a Gödel problem. So this one is human value drift or human value change. How would we want to constrain? A lot of people tell me they don't want their values to drift randomly or excessively, but that they want to they want to be open to moral learning in the future. Defining how this both can happen. Defining how both of these can happen is tricky. I don't really know how to do it. And a related thing is when the AI tells you, here, I have perfectly distilled your preferences and synthesized them into this utility function. Isn't it lovely? And then the human reacts inevitably, no, that's not what I want. Whatever the AI gives it, because this is just how humans are. This is a natural feature. I'm pretty sure that if I looked at my explicit preferences, my preferences made explicit, I would say, no, that's not it. So this is kind of, you can say that this is a Gödel self-reference problem, but it's a very common one. So this is also, I don't really know how to do it. You can imagine the AI says, okay, I know what it is, I'm going to manipulate the human. So I'm going to give them a fake one. They're going to say no, they're going to change it, and we'll converge on the real one. So maybe you can solve that problem by allowing the AI to manipulate the human. But in any case, the question of so I'll get to the equilibria in a second. The question of how you deal with moral drift, value change, moral learning, and us accepting that the AI has decided this is what our preferences are, is something I genuinely am not sure how to deal with. Now, equilibria. Equilibria is a problem. If it's a local equilibria, i.e. defined by local conditions, then there is no limit to how far the values can drift. I had a Mahatma Armstrong less wrong post where I imagined starting off wanting to becoming more compassionate and ending up with killing all life in a series of improvements. So Not murder Gandhi exactly. It's basically over compassionate Gandhi, whose compassion expands too much, and encompasses the animals, encompasses the insect, encompasses the plants, encompasses the rocks, and at that point, humans and animal life can be reduced to rock destroyers. The point wasn't to take that particularly seriously, but just that if it's an equilibrium just defined by sort of local conditions, i.e., it's reflexively stable, it would not want further modifications or anything like that, it can be arbitrarily far away. Another option, which I prefer, is to tie these preferences to, say, some sort of starting point. So we still look for sort of a best equilibrium of some sort based on some conditions, but also we don't want to move too far away from the beginning. So we don't just do a random walk in value space. Now, some people call this equilibria, some people call it fixed point, and they are technically correct. But I don't think that that's necessarily a good way of seeing it, because it's the result of a complicated constructive process, and it's better to look at that complicated constructive processes. Equilibrium, knowing your preferences does not change your preferences. Yeah, but that's not human. That's not human. There is no moral learning at this point. I would be very wary and at least careful about approaching a state where knowing your preferences does not change your preferences. There are many bad ways of getting to that state. Lobotomies, for example, or manipulating people into the equivalent of lobotomies. So if I said that equilibrium was a desirable target, and if it's really hard to get with something reasonable, but really easy to get with something dangerous, then I would be very wary of it. That's the main reason that I haven't looked too much at equilibriums.
Okay.
Do we have the capacity to explore this space without actually using the human? Because I feel like then you can look for equilibria which are stable, but also which the current human's identity preferences wouldn't object to too strongly, or something like that.
I'm not sure.
I mean, because you have this problem that the thing can explode off into some distant thing. But do you have to take the human with you, or can the system predict what the human would do and do several steps and then ask the current human, is this a place you would be happy to end up?
I mean, but this is, if the AI is super intelligent, asking the human is kind of irrelevant. This is just then a manipulation of finding the best phrasing to get the human to accept the best outcome for the AI.
Right.
The aim of the synthesis process is so that all this can be done automatically. But yeah, pretty much the grass is always greener is a way of saying that. Yeah, it's basically the answer that I gave to the previous question. Since it's a known feature that humans tend to reject having their values imposed on them, I would not want to look for something without that feature, or at least not put too much pressure on that, lest that push us away from the human areas that we know.
Regarding imposing values on people, or seeming to impose them. This gives a picture of the AI presenting results to the person, but you instead, if you get the person to make a series of forced choices, in other words, put them through a questionnaire or something, present them with alternatives, make them choose, and so on, the result that comes out at the end is something that they see as something they've produced, and I think they wouldn't resist it in the same way. They might be surprised, they might find it very difficult to do it, but they wouldn't see it as something imposed on them.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, perhaps you could say the role of the AI in that situation is not to come up with the answers, but to conduct this process, this transparent and acceptable process. People produce the answers.
What you're saying there is basically the nicer version of what I said. The AI figures out what your preferences are and manipulates you into accepting it. This is basically how do we get the endorsement of the human on the outcome of this process, in a sort of general sense. And I have not figured out how to do that, mainly because I need to have a lot more details of the preferences of the whole process before I get even near the sort of what's the final thing you do with it. But yes, thinking about how humans can endorse the outcome in a good way is going to be valuable when this is deployed in practice. And it might be worth sacrificing, or not necessarily sacrificing, but tweaking certain aspects of the process in order to get human endorsement, as long as it's not an overriding goal. And I just want to point out that all these questions have been about the synthesize the human preferences, which I said is the longest part of the thing, and it is, but also somewhat less important than the finding out the human's internal models. And I understand why, because the second part is so much more interesting to talk about, even if it is, in a sense, less important. And I've got another question here. Can human preferences be circular? Yes, human preferences are very often circular. Though we interestingly have we have something that stops us getting stuck in loops. It tends to be that as we travel around the circle, we break the cycle at the point where we come back to the beginning. If there would be a circular preference, it's kind of like we have a deep knowledge that getting back to the starting point makes no sense.
Okay, so I can see the next question.
Did I answer the previous question properly? I feel I might not have addressed. Anyway.
Well, my question.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yes, that's fine for the moment. Thanks. I'm
okay.
So unclear about all this that but that's not your fault.
Thanks.
Okay, so the next question actually was also about different ways you could do this synthesis, both with something like the parliamentary model by Nick Bostrom, and I think David also had a market-based model. But I think you might be right that that is somewhat less interesting. So let me see. There is here.
Oh, it's fascinating.
Oh yeah,
It's
yeah.
too interesting. Is the problem.
But it's more robust in a way. That if we do the synthesis, I would expect that a lot of different kinds of synthesis processes end up with basically the same result.
Or
Whereas,
at least similarly acceptable results. They might be somewhat different in outcomes, but equally acceptable. If they don't, then this is something to be panicked by, because that means something is going wrong. If slight changes in the sort of process, the synthesis process, can result in things that are not only wildly different, but moving from good to bad and back, then there's something wrong with the process. There's some key flaw that we've not addressed.
okay. I don't know. I will take Rob's question in just a moment, and then it seems like a big part of the reason why we expect this to not have catastrophic consequences is that we are taking all the humans' partial preferences and leaving nothing in the model behind. And I think taking all the partial preferences seems like a tall order. There is probably something. There might be infinite many of them, and even if we get infinitely many of them, we might still skip a part of them. Is this a correct interpretation?
Yeah, I mean, human imagination is not infinite, and even if it is technically infinite, it's sort of infinite because you can slide one variable continuously in a small range. So the I don't know. Is it section 2.6, 2.8? Basically, what I'm saying is that most preferences should be absorbed in the model, leaving only very few rare types of meta preferences that are really about the outcomes and that really resist being synthesized into the model. These are the ones that I'm appealing to when I'm talking about an adequate outcome or an acceptable outcome or a good outcome. Just a minor, we're not total utilitarians, for example, and we're definitely not average utilitarians. And the difference between, say, 51% total utilitarian, 49% average, or vice versa, or any sort of mixed theories like that, if you tweak the percentages by 1% in each direction, you end up in a very, very different world, because the optimizing goal is different, and this can result in a very different world. But the sort of judgments that they're all kind of okay, that some type of underdefinedness in our preferences mean that there's some openness for different ways of synthesizing it. This, for example, is something that can't be really captured as an actual human preferences within the model. It's a statement about a bit of variability outside the model. I will stop using the word model because there are too many uses of it. This is a statement about the synthesis process. And the whole thing where I say, beware disastrous outcomes or add extra precautions to avoid disastrous outcomes is a sort of judgment. It's a meta preferences about the violation of all other preferences, in a sense. And it kind of works as a meta preference within the synthesis process, but I don't think it can fully be captured. I have another point. This is a really minor point about the the fact that complexity might not matter that much because the AI can be efficient rooting around human complexity without losing it. That's a completely impossible thing to have as something within the model. This is a sort of odd, within the synthesis process, this is an odd judgment call from outside about what's acceptable. So there are a bunch of things that really feel as if they can't quite get into the model. But apart from those, the idea is that everything, your preferences, your meta-preferences, your enjoyment of the parliamentary model or of different other ones, all that should go in.
Okay, I think that answered my question. Then Robert had one in the text.
Okay, so this is why I did a few, 2-3 posts about how I saw human symbol grounding functioning. The basic idea is to do it in a sense empirically. Identifies, suppose I was to say that there's a certain neuron combinations that when they go off together, this means mother-in-law, or this means that particular person's mother-in-law, or something like that. So I have grounded, I'm claiming there's a grounding for these internal symbols. How would we check this? Well, we might put the person in an fMRI and present their mother-in-law to them and see what fires. So in a sense, when I make this claim, I am saying that the firing of these neurons should correspond to certain states in the outside world, and notably those where the mother-in-law appears or is thought of or something like that. So I'm saying that actually knowing the internal states or the internal variables, I can make predictions about the outside world. This is my sort of avenue towards empirical symbol grounding. It's sort of saying, if you say this is the symbol, this is its grounding, I say, okay, I will check that. I will look at the symbol, by which we mean certain things inside the human brain, and I will see if it co-varies with what it's grounded on, which is certain states of the outside world.
Okay, Ashes also have a question, and I just realized I should have asked him to type it down in advance. Here, he has done that. Great.
I want an ideal AI to be able to get linearly better at satisfying me as it learns my preferences. So the graph, what sort of, do you think? Do you want this to be an upper bound? Is it a lower bound? Is it an upper bound?
For me, I would be most interested in a lower bound. In at least, what can we be reasonably certain to avoid? Can we be certain to avoid that it suddenly believes that we like suffering or something like that?
Well, I'm asking because there were some people who actually prefer that an AI not become brilliant at satisfying their preferences immediately. I can see why they might want that. This is basically the corrigibility instinct, it's basically safer if the AI grows in power slowly and so on. But if we put that aside, then I don't see why we want it to be linear as a lower bound. We want it to go as well as possible. Right, I'm finding the question, sorry, because it skipped.
Let me
No, it's just me. I'm just sort of scrolling up. Actually, I can maximize that and see all the questions. That's fine. The thing is that the graph doesn't always look like that. What this suggests is that basically we need to get the irreversible preferences in quickly. I mean, the AI should naturally do this, but if we wanted to sort of hand design it, it's basically the ones that can't be undone should be, the preferences should be there in quickly before before it gets there. Before it makes too many changes. As I say, normally this is something that should be picked up automatically, but it is an argument for at least having the AI in a training box for at least a while. And the next question is, so what increments do you think are really part in the process of learning or in the intermediate stages as an AI develops? No idea. I'm sorry, I'm being a bit glib, but I really have no idea how the process will go out and how fast the AI will converge on something we find adequate, and how we perceive it from outside. Next question: what if the AI is brilliant at satisfying their preferences? They would know to not brilliantly satisfy that person's preferences. Yes, that is the case, unless we don't want the AI. This is basically a form of manipulative behavior. One of the reasons that I've given up trying to rule out manipulative behavior is that I find it impossible to define. It's respecting their preferences, but it's also manipulating them, because one of the reasons that they want you to go slow is because they're afraid of what happens if you could go fast. And if you could go fast but pretend to go slow, this is sort of manipulating them. And it's for reasons like this that I can't really find a good definition of what manipulating means, because arguably this is a manipulation that is in accordance with what they want. So there should be a strict ordering to what you learn, and you throw out something you learn too early. Just naturally in the process of learning, the early stuff will get improved upon. The strict ordering on what you learn is just to prevent mistakes, irreversible mistakes at the initial, early on, when the AI doesn't have enough of our preferences.
Would just consider an example? I'm finding this terribly abstract.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, for example, we were just talking about people not wanting to have their preferences satisfied too quickly. So I was imagining somebody winning the lottery, winning £1 million on the lottery, and saying, "I'm afraid what this will do to my life. So I'd like to have the money fed to me more slowly, or I'd like to experience the life of a millionaire for a month, and then decide what I want to do after that." Is this what we have in mind? And likewise, this learning, throwing out something that we've learned too early. I need an example.
No, what you're saying is not an example of that. What you're saying is something that might be desirable anyway, could be desirable, depending on the human. It could be desirable. I was just saying that something like that is also, in a sense, manipulative, or could be manipulative. It's sort of tricky. The borderline between the perfect butler and the perfect evil Grand Vizier is not a sharp one. If your desires are anticipated and all your objections are anticipated, this shades into manipulation. Anyway, so that's not the throw out what something does early. I'm not saying you should throw out anything that is learned early. It's just that it will get updated. The things I was saying, that if there was an ordering, we should have it learn, like it might, for instance, nuke the planet and kill everyone, and then regret deeply that it did this. Sort of simplistic example. We don't want it to do that. We want it to realize that some things we consider irreversible. On the other hand, it might sort of take apart an asteroid and fling bits of it into the sun, and we really don't care about that. In a sense, both of these are equally irreversible, but the killing everyone is something we strongly object to, and the disassembling an asteroid and chucking bits into the sun is something we basically don't care about at all. So we should quickly teach it what we consider irreversible disasters, so that it doesn't do those in the process of learning the other values.
Yeah.
Okay, let me see if I can find any...
By the way, for that quote there, I think you should put evil Grand Vizier, just in case people don't realize.
Okay.
The perfect evil Grand Vizier.
In the beginning of your presentation, you had an example of 3 people estimating the rationality, H, L, and K, I believe you called them, obtaining pretty much the same results, in that all 3 had the same models and believed that the reason why people were playing chess is because they want to win, because that is what our empathy model would believe we would do that in that situation. But it seems that this is these 3 people are likely to fail in very much the same way. So how can we? I've taken a quote here from you that we can see that the method stops working when the internal models that we have and those others have start to diverge. And my feeling is that they might be broken in pretty much the same way.
Well, so to give an even simpler example than the chess one, if I was to get red in the face, start shouting things at Søren, and punch him, people would conclude that I was angry at Søren and wished to do him harm. I would agree with them in this hypothetical, almost certainly. So this is an example of a behavior where almost everyone agrees on it. The strong emotions, people tend to agree on it. And there is a lot of, these are sort of the strong similarities I've seen. Now,
just quick, my example might be something like the reason why you are red in your face is because you've been stung by a bee and have a allergy to that, and you're trying to swipe away a bee from my face. So that's why everybody thinks that you are angry with me, but actually you're trying to protect me from the bees.
Mm-hmm. That's a possibility, and hopefully further evidence should elucidate that problem. But to get back to sort of your question, I'm saying that the 3 models are sort of similar, and this is true, and that it's a sort of shortcut. But what I'm defining to be the true one is the person's internal model. So whether I'm angry or in pain and helping you, so angry versus bees, the true model is the one inside my head. Now, maybe I was angry at you, and then I noticed that there are hundreds of people watching us, and then I noticed a bee, and then pretended that the bee was the cause of it. And then people would misjudge that, and they would get it wrong. But the truth, in this sense, is the model within my head. The similarity with other humans is a way of accessing this truth at least better than random, without disassembling my brain and having perfect fMRI or that kind of thing. So when our internal models, okay, so in a sense, our models of other people's models are proxy measures. So they fail in the way that proxy measures fail, especially when we move beyond typical situations. But my argument is that in the grand scheme of things, they're pretty good proxy methods that can get us a significant chunk of the way.
Might we not run into Goodhart's law with these?
Yes.
Because we're trying to end up in a very different place from where we are right now.
If we rely on my models of someone else's models to give them their values, well, we don't run into Goodhart's law. We are basically using the wrong definition. What's going to happen is we're going to assign someone their values, which is my judgment of their values. What should happen is that we have my judgment of their values, other ways of measuring their internal models, either through their stated preferences, in reliable situations and in unreliable situations. So lots of examples of people saying things which we believe are true, people saying things which we believe are false. Lots of different estimates for what these internal things are, and maybe an actual definition of what it is, which the AI can then sift the outside evidence towards finding that. But yes, if you say if you use my internal models to find someone else's values, then it's wrong. It won't be me. It won't be as its disaster mode is different from other Goodhart situations with AI, but it's the wrong. You're doing the wrong thing. And if you don't add some uncertainty or some fuzziness or some definitional thing to reflect the fact that you're doing the wrong thing, then you won't correct for the fact that you're doing the wrong thing.
Okay. Let's another question. You have you define the one-step hypothetical, where you have like a minimal one-step change in the human's brain, where you suppose that, and then one simple thing, and then how would you react in this situation? And I expect you could also say there's like a zero-step hypothetical, like a simple question, and then maybe an infinite step hypothetical that would be in this really strange situation, what would you prefer? Something where you, which seems to me like the coherent extrapolated volition. I don't know if this is precisely what you mean. So, and also my question is, one step seems to be fine, but two steps are not. How come?
It's basically dealing with the whole problem of manipulation again. The more interaction there is, the more possibility for manipulation there is. And also the more possibility there is for creating human values where they didn't exist before. If you take, say, some, in thousands of experiments, you always have isolated tribes, and you present them with episodes of Star Trek or something like that. They may develop preferences for something completely outside their realm of expertise, because they've sort of been presented a story which tugs on their standard field. Yeah, basically it's that. The further you go, the more scope there is for manipulation. If we can, or for just creating the values out of thin air. If we can deal with that problems, then there's no problem with multiple step hypotheticals. It's exclusively for that. And the realism that it's not just a zero step is so that we can actually go somewhere that isn't immediately thought of.
So with one-step hypotheticals, how far away can you get from our current state? Can you get sufficiently far?
Well,
might
in a
that be...
sense, I expect that this is going to be a sort of empirical question. However we define one or two-step hypotheticals, one sign that things are going wrong is if rephrasing of things that are logically similar or logically equivalent gives very different answers on the part of the human. So that's a sign of, well, manipulation or creating new values or those kind of things. So in a sense, how safe these are is a relatively empirical question. There might be something also, there might be situations like with adversarial examples in value learning. It might be that most examples, most hypotheticals you can phrase are okay, but there are a few that give really edge results. In that case, we might be able to just say, use the sort of central examples, don't use the optimized edge cases or the equivalent of adversarial examples. So yes, so this is a to some extent, there are empirical ways of dealing with this. Hopefully.
Yeah, let me see if we can find any other. Yeah, I had this one. This was actually more a question of ensuring that I understood, because in the reading group I tried to explain some of this, and I had 4 kinds of meta preferences, and I think I might be confused about some of these. So here I have the standard self-referential, like all simple meta preferences should be penalized. Russell style preferences, penalizing those that are not mentioned explicitly, the set of preferences that are not contained in it, and the ones whether they're inconsistent I call Gödel style, and the antisynthesis preferences, those that don't want to be a person doesn't want to be reduced to a utility function. Is this roughly correct?
I wouldn't necessarily label them like that, but these are all interesting examples. Do you want me to, can I go through them?
Please do.
So the last one is the one I've already told you that I don't really know how to cope with. I've sketched a few examples of how it might work, but those are sort of real hacks. All simple meta preferences should be penalized, should not be assigned to itself. It's not explicitly self-referential, and if you remove its implicit self-referential, I mean, this is something that someone can have in a not too silly example. Like I might have a mild version of this due to my fear of losing oversimplification. And thinking about it, I would not want this to be applied to itself because it's there to prevent things from happening, not to be self-referential and tossed out. So I see no problem in, so self-referential things are a problem, but I see no problem in just saying this one, don't apply it to itself. All preferences not mentioned here should be penalized. Presumably there's a list that goes with it of preferences that are mentioned here.
Yeah.
This sort of, all preferences that don't come from my study of the Bible should be penalized is something that some people have, for example. These sort of religious preferences are tricky because they're generally factually wrong, or they premise things that are factually wrong. But there's probably secular versions of this of everything that does not derive from Marxist-Leninist thoughts within me should be penalized. And again, I see no problem with not self-referencing it.
Just to be clear, is this Russell's paradox is that whether the set that contains all sets that don't contain themselves, if that's contained within itself. And so you talk about Russell style preferences but you don't give an example. So I was wondering if this is an example, or do you have a better example in mind of a Russell style preference?
Russell style. I think I was thinking of Russell and Gödel's style as basically self-reference, as just a shorthand for self-reference, or for things that say bad things about themselves or rule themselves out. Like Russell would be the barber who doesn't. The barber shaves only those who don't shave themselves. All preferences not mentioned here should be penalized, and then you give a long list that doesn't include that preference. So the thing is, when I say glibly, this should not be allowed to refer to itself, this is what people tried to do mathematically for a long time and failed. They were sort of saying, well, these Gödel things, these Russell things, they're kind of very dubious examples. They don't crop out much. Why don't we just put them aside? And it turned out we couldn't do that mathematically. But in genuine human preferences, I don't see these sort of things coming up very often. And generally when in most cases, the self-references just don't let it self-reference. And if there's a cycle of two preferences referencing each other in a way that would push themselves up or push themselves down, then just break the cycle, and if there's a contradiction, deal with it like other contradictory preferences. So this is an approach that I think should be applied to humans, not to any logically conceivable agent, just because. And so inconsistent preferences should be penalized. Well, if you have a value of inconsistent, if you have a certain judgment of inconsistency that might include this thing itself, if it's, again, I think just breaking the reference to itself could work. If these are weak preferences, then the main thing is not to allow them to blow up. Preferences should not be allowed to blow up. Minor preferences should not become major through self-references. Major preferences should not become minor through self-preferences. But minor preferences could stay minor or become vanishing through self-references. That's less of a problem. So this is kind of my answer now. I see things in the chat have appeared.
Yes, Robert has a question first.
Okay. Self-reference meta-prefs are troublesome, so all meta-preferences that apply to themselves should be penalized. Yeah, possibly, but I mean, people don't really have preferences like that, or they tend to hold them quite weakly. They might make themselves hold them strongly. The way I am basically going to try and do it, if I have to do this, is to assign every preference to a ordinal or to a integer. And all preferences refer only to ones that are lower themselves on the scale. And I am going to do some sort of energy minimization to map everything to this format. So some sort of energy minimization process to break all the cycles. Victoria, could you elaborate please on standard self-referential? Why would you want to penalize simple meta preferences? Okay, there is a meta preference that I am very scared of, and that is simple preferences should be overweighted. I see this leading to the repugnant conclusion. I see this leading to discarding so many of human preferences on the altar of simplicity. So that is a meta preferences that I am very scared of. An over seeking of simplicity is something that I think could end disastrously. So I do not want to penalize simple meta preferences. I want to stop them from an oversized domination. So that's why I said I might have something vaguely in that area. Of course, this is within limits. If you don't have some form of Occam's razor, you don't get anywhere. So I'm not in favor of arbitrarily complex preferences either. But especially for philosophers, I see the failure mode of over simple preferences, as being the problem.
Okay. Okay. I actually had another question about this, so let me see if I can find that. Hold on.
So Rob Miles said that simple preferences should be boosted is itself simple. Yes, and this, if you have a very mild preference for that, it should not then become a dominant preference just through boosting itself. It's very clear that preferences should not be allowed to boost themselves to heavy weights if they don't have that weight initially.
I've tried to, here on the screen, come up with some arguments why you might actually want to why it might not be so bad, or why it might be desirable to have a more compact, simple, elegant utility function. Like, for instance, if you want to convince people to have a utility function, then if you can say, like if you have some big symbols like this is your value of friendship, this is how you value art. If you have a utility function with these kind of big things in it, then people would probably be more likely to accept it compared to if it's very, very specialized and it's like a million factors and people don't understand it at all. So that's my first argument for this. And the second is that it might be possible to prove statements about elegant utility functions. Things like you will not regret if you tell the AI to maximize this utility function. And I think also if you want to try to do any kind of philosophical validation on it, that might be easier with an elegant utility function compared to one that you can test with the computer and see what the utility function does in different ways, but you can't really understand it.
Mm-hmm. So the second statement I don't think is all that relevant because this is about how you can convince someone you will not regret adapting this utility function. Well, then after that, you might just have no opportunity for regret. This is basically an equilibrium statement that doesn't mean all that much unless we define regret in some complicated way that captures our current feeling of what regret would mean. Easier to convince people to accept, possibly. I also feel that you might be able to obfuscate a lot of the nastier parts of their self-image in some of the details, but it seems that is plausible. Different class of errors can hide in elegant, and different class of errors can hide in verbose. Elegant, most of the work is philosophical. Most of the work is computer-based testing. I just basically see people's preferences as, you virtually never see someone say, well, you very rarely see something that is perfectly defined, my preferences, but actually you've gone a bit too complicated. You do see examples of that. So I see your arguments for elegant utility functions. I just see that the mess of human preferences, all the kludges we have, and that a too strong preference for elegance would involve sacrificing huge amounts of our current values, and in my view, far too many. Of course, this is a relative statement, and people who are philosophers who have strong meta preferences here will end up probably with more simple and elegant utility functions than most people.
Okay, I think that just about concludes it. Or did Robert have a final question here? I think
In the hypothetical scenario that there actually is a simple, clear, single that captures all human values we somehow miss, would the process find it? In this hypothetical, what defines that there is and that captures all of human value?
I suppose what I'm
Moral
saying
realism?
is if there was you could imagine something that was designed to spit out something simple, and then it does spit out something simple, and everybody goes, oh, yeah, that's correct. I don't know how we managed to try and do all this philosophy for so long without realizing that gives me what I want. This is actually what I value. And is a process capable of finding that if it did exist?
It's capable of finding some versions of it. In some situations it is, not in all situations. Like what you're describing seems very similar to a hypnotic hack, which we would not want. We would not want it to
right
to find. But if, like, the way I could see it happening is if it does all this complicated things and it turns out that there are, say, 500 factors, or let's be dramatic, 50 factors on which all of human values load very strongly and all the rest looks like noise, then this is some way that it could end up finding this thing. It's, yeah, the ultimately convincing argument probably won't find, because all the precautions to avoid manipulation are going to be pushing against that, because so the sort of things that are confirmed, yeah, that's the right thing, it wouldn't sort of find. Things that are surprisingly simple when you do the extraction process, it would find.
Okay.
Okay. Chris, you have a metaphor?
Yes. In my, I'm always searching for concrete examples to ground my understanding of these mind-boggling abstractions. And I'm trying, and also I'm deeply, I react very strongly against the idea of what it means to synthesize human values into a general utility function. And does it make sense to say, to compare the process to, like, if you have a lot of runners in the 10,000 meters, they all have their separate preferences. Very largely, their preferences to win the race, and obviously those are mutually incompatible. And so you organize a race. So the business of, when we synthesizing their values, you don't really synthesize their values. What you do is you organize a race with rules, so that you can have an outcome, and they can participate, knowing that this is, at least gives them a shot at achieving their preferences. And then beyond this, if you think about organizing the Olympic Games, again, you can't synthesize everybody's preferences or values or anything like that, except in a very general, high-level sense. And somehow we do manage to organize Olympic Games, which a lot of things are going on. People's desires to make money, to achieve personal fame, to achieve national glory, or to, I don't know, promote peace between the nations or something. All these different things are being, you are attempting to achieve all these things in organizing something like the Olympic Games, and to some extent you succeed. Is this an analogy for what you are trying to do with your research agenda? Or is it a bad analogy?
It could work as an analogy. By the way, I keep on using synthesize and construct to emphasize that this is a constructive process with a lot of contingent choices. And I'm also not particularly enamored of utility functions just for the sake of utility functions, but they seem to be stable in the way that other representations are not. But maybe to develop your analogy, it would be, how can we arrange the outcomes of the Olympic Games to satisfy people's preferences to the maximum? Obviously, we only have a certain number of golds and bronzes and even silvers to give out. I give them out in that order because that seems to be the happiness order of the people who get the medals. But we also have opportunities for people to get an unexpected sponsorship deal, to maybe fall in love, to outperform some personal milestone, to be a key player at a key moment, to make it on television. This is what I was meaning when I was saying that very few values are completely antagonistic. Then this is basically finding the best way of satisfying the most. And the values within a human tend to be even more non-antagonistic. Like someone who wants to eat chocolate and have great self-discipline these are not there are sort of technological, or there are worlds in which these can easily be both satisfied, and there are ways of building their self-discipline and allowing them to indulge in the right amount of chocolate, for example. So even these things that seem as if they're completely antagonistic are just sort of mildly so. Does that so that sort of does that combined with your metaphor sort of help?
I think so. I was thinking more directly than the Olympic Games. I was thinking about political ways of ordering society, where you have these conflicts between freedom and equality and utilitarian well-being for as many people as possible, and so that's the kind of tensions that I was wondering whether an AI can solve for us. So yeah, that seems to tie in with what you're saying. So you're saying something optimistic that these things can be.
Well, given superpowered AI, then yes, I mean there are a lot of, people can be satisfied in surprisingly odd situations. There's some people whose best time of their lives were in prison. There is the whole medium fish in a small pond, which many people seem to like. It's just a question of setting up the various small ponds. Like if you're online games, for example, people seem to enjoy them and enjoy a certain level of success, even though there's only sort of one person who's the best at that game at any time, and a couple of hundred who are even in contention for the top. People still seem to enjoy that and get sort of rush from victory and enjoy being higher in the ladder than other people. So that there are a lot of levers that a super intelligent AI, a super powered AI could pull. So this is in the sort of utopia, everything is solved or kind of thing. The easiest thing is that a lot of people are antagonistic because they're sort of have different status they're on the same status ladder or the same dominance ladder. the easiest thing is to put them on different status ladders and have their worlds going more the way they want, or the bits that they see, or the bits that are relevant to them.
Yeah. No, good, thanks. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. So I think that was just about it. So I would like to say thank you once again to Stuart Armstrong for coming here and answering our questions. And we wish you good luck with your research agenda.
Thank you. And if anybody wants to sort of take part or help or direct anyone towards it, I'd be greatly appreciative. And general feedback is also welcome. Oh, and on the Oracle question, there is a £1,000 available for winning the contest in the link I posted at the very beginning of the talk. So thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And on a practical note, next week we will be meeting in the reading group on Tuesday the 21st, and we will discuss Jeff Hawkins' article about why he is optimistic about AGI within the next 20 years. So thank you everyone, and see you next week.